Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on how leaders and organizations skillfully adapt to our increasingly complex world. My name is Peter Cully, and I'm the president of the Association of Change Management Professionals, Australia and New Zealand chapter. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce four wonderful people who are joining us to have a thought-provoking and insightful dialogue on this topic. Let's first welcome Megan Tyler, who is a managing director, Asia Pacific, and leader at Accenture, specializing in operating model and organizational design in their strategy and consulting practice. Megan is known for her collaborative, humanistic, and pragmatic style and comes with over 30 years of experience partnering with business leaders to reimagine and optimize their operating models, organizational architectures, core processes, and ways of working. She has led teams targeting transformation initiatives across most parts of the value chain, from product, marketing, and sales functions to enablement areas such as research, analytics, HR, legal, IT, and operations. She has a strong focus on new ways of working and enterprise-wide agility via greater team autonomy, end-to-end flow, and speed to value. Megan has been a key contributor to a recently published book on rethinking operating models, and it is our pleasure to have her join us today. A very warm welcome to you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Peter.
I would now like to introduce Dr. Aiden Thornton, who is a complexity leadership expert, management consultant, psychometrics entrepreneur, and street epistemologist. Aiden holds an interdisciplinary PhD in leadership, complexity, and cognition, and serves as the inaugural Menzies Senior Research Fellow in Leadership and Complexity at the Australian National University's School of Cybernetics. As a co-lead of the ANU Complexity Leadership Lab, Aiden's work spans the theory, measurement, research, education, and practice of complexity leadership. He applies the principles of cybernetics, systems thinking, and complexity science to make sense of leadership and its development. He's deeply committed to classical libertarianism, I would say, and brings a unique blend of intellectual intensity, pragmatism, and a wicked sense of humor to his work. Great to have you on board today.
Thanks so much, Peter. I really appreciate it.
Please join me in welcoming Rory van der Merwe, a director of our South Africa chapter for ACMP. Rory excels in enabling leaders to translate strategy into pragmatic delivery through engaged team contributions, driving improved performance. He co-creates sustainable solutions to navigate change and disruption, and builds and manages complex relationships through stakeholder engagement to overcome silo thinking. Rory leverages his research through the lens of trauma-informed change, advocating and teaching leaders to be dealers in hope, build bridges rather than burn them, make intentional, deliberate, and purposeful choices for better tomorrows, set and adjust direction, promote mindsets for positive and sustainable impact, and apply adaptability and adaptive capacity for well-being and performance impact in organizations. Rory, big welcome to you today, and lovely to have the South Africa chapter on board.
Thank you, and I'm talking from a different time zone, so it's good morning from my side, and looking forward to the rest of my day as you guys wind down.
Great to have you on board, Rory. And finally, it's my great pleasure to introduce our chapter vice president and co-board member, Brad Rilatt. We are delighted to have him as our esteemed facilitator for this webinar today. Brad is the MD and founder of Leadership Gold and brings a wealth of experience and expertise in lead, change, communicate, and create constructive cultures that consistently deliver superior results and enduring impacts. He's done this across more than 1,000 organizations and enterprises in over 25 countries, making him a perfect guide for today's session. With a proven track record in organizational culture design, leadership and executive development, facilitation and coaching, conflict transformation, Brad excels in the ability to create meaningful dialogue and collaboration in challenging environments. With the energy and professional curiosity that Brad brings, I believe he is uniquely positioned to make today's webinar both insightful and engaging. Without much more ado, Brad, please join me in welcoming you, first of all, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Pete, and it's wonderful to be with you all today, including, of course, our good friend Rory, who's just getting up, and the rest of us who are navigating our way towards the evening. So This is going to be a really interesting conversation amongst friends. And really, when we talk about dialogue, we're talking about this wonderful, safe exchange of meaning, different perspectives. And I think, certainly in my view anyway, we have three of the thought leaders and practitioners in this incredible space. And I couldn't ask for three better people to spend some time with this afternoon or this evening, and for Rory this morning. So let's get underway in sharing our differing perspectives in ways that hopefully will be helpful to those that watch this video over the next weeks and months, whether they are members of our Association of Change Management Professionals or there are other colleagues that we want to share this with. Now, to that end, this is going to be a bit of a light touch. We want to be able to have this conversation relatively freely. And my friends here know that we want to be able to add to each other's perspective, but also bring your own unique perspective on these issues. So to get this underway, let's have a look at this overarching question. How can leaders and organizations skillfully adapt, being a key word here, to an ever-increasingly complex world? That is the overarching question that's got us together this afternoon or this evening. And we've got a number of other questions within that. So I'm going to ask one of our colleagues here on this discussion panel to literally give us those early thoughts as you started considering how you might contribute today. What are your thoughts around this question? Now, I'm going to be bold and say, who would like to go first? Who would like to take the microphone first?
I'm happy to get the party started.
I thought you might be, Aiden. Over to you, my friend.
Thanks so much, Brad. So, I mean, look, so leaders and organizations skillfully adapting to our increasingly complex world. I think there are any number of ways that we can support leaders and organizations to do that. But I think that it won't come as any surprise that my main interest is by going down the path of complexity leadership. And this is my main area of expertise. And what on earth is complexity leadership? Well, complexity leadership is really a way of taking some of the main insights from complexity science to make sense of leadership and how to develop it. And in some ways, complexity leadership, I think, is a response to the limitations of some more traditional approaches to leadership. If we look at the way that leaders and leadership is being developed in many organizations, we often see a focus on things like behavioral styles and personality traits and, individual values and charisma and these types of things. And all of that stuff is fantastic. I think all of that's got a time and a place. But I also think that when it comes to helping leaders deal with complexity, there's also a number of limitations. And so, in my view, complexity leadership represents a fundamentally different way of thinking about leadership and its development. It shifts away from focusing just on individual leaders to being inclusive of individual leaders and collective leadership. It thinks about leadership as a much more kind of emergent and distributed phenomenon, not just kind of as a top-down management type process. And from this perspective, I think that generally speaking, there are three broad buckets of skills that leaders need to cultivate. One bucket is around complexity skills, around rising to the challenge of complexity. Two is around adaptive skills, or being able to adapt your mindset and behaviors, your brain-body system in real time. And the third bucket is around the collaborative skills, around how we foster a sense of togetherness. So with that in mind, maybe I'll stop there and hand over to one of our other colleagues to hear what their perspectives are.
That really has set the scene, Aiden. Thank
Yeah.
you very much. And perhaps I could go to Megan now and get your early thoughts on this large question.
Absolutely. I probably come from a slightly different angle than Aiden, although I completely echo everything he's just mentioned. My background's obviously more in operating model and org design. So the word that jumped out from that problem statement to me is the word adapt. And how can we help organisations and leaders set up the system that they operate within to make sure that they are constantly and continually able to sort of flex and adapt to this big dynamic world that we all exist in today. The business strategy, what they do may stay the same. The business model, the business model around the products and services that they take to their customers through their various channels may also remain the same. But the operating model, so how they execute, how they configure all of their resources, their people, their funding to actually deliver on that strategy and that business model really does need to be set up in a way that is constantly being reviewed and revisited so that they can sense and respond to whatever's going on in that market. So I think a lot of people believe that just means organisation design, but operating model is a lot more than that. So today you'll hear me talk a little bit about yes, structure and organisational design, but also leadership roles, as Aiden just mentioned, the governance and processes that are needed to kind of connect and bridge the different parts of that organisation structure, the metrics, the talent, and the ways of working, all of that being so critical to be connected and aligned for that system to operate effectively. So I'll leave that there, but that will be the angle that I'm taking into today's conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Megan. And let's have a little contribution from Rory. What are your thoughts on this high level, first of all?
I'm going to begin with a quote from a colleague in Africa. She's a senator in Kenya, and she's disabled in that she actually has a visual challenge. And in Parliament, she actually quoted the following. She said, "If all you see is all you see, then you don't see all there is to be seen." So I want to bring a Black African disabled woman's perspective. I know that quote is around from various other people, but I want to throw a mixture in here in terms of what else and what might be, and really pull Aiden's kind of concept around the possibility. Because it's one thing to adapt, but if you just keep adapting and you remain fluid, that's okay, but so what? So I come with a very practical lens, which is South Africa is ranked at the moment as probably one of the world leaders, oftentimes in the wrong things. So for example, we have the highest youth unemployment rate besides the countries that are at war. That's a massive challenge at a sociological level, at an economic level, at a hope level, at a how do you actually, bring people into the economy. So another practical thing that I want to sort of put on the table is we need to be aware of the dynamic in which we operate. So, global tensions, things that are out of our control. So one of the things, for example, and I think we'll leverage it just now with Aiden's complexity stuff, but call it circles of influence. We're very aware, COVID taught us, what's in my control, and I can manage that. And then there's kind of a stretch a little bit in terms of, what's in my circle of influence, and we can maybe manage a little bit more of that. But a lot of that is also, it's like herding cats. And then we kind of overwhelmed in COVID, and it was that, well, what's the circle of concern? What's out of my control? When is Donald Trump making the next executive order that's going to actually, the ripple impact will be hundreds of thousands of lives lost because US aid is not supplying drugs in Africa. Now, when he makes an executive order, he doesn't understand the ripple impact downstream. We do know the next executive order is coming. We just don't know what it's going to look like and what those impacts will be. So I found a fascinating concept recently, and it's called the circle of adapt. So somewhere between control and influence and concern, which is out of our control, is this circle of adapt. And what I want to try and put on the table is, what are we going to do? Because it's wonderful to talk and it's wonderful to theorize, but practically, what do we do? And I think the angle I'm going to try and put on the table is, so what for me now? Fantastic,
Rory. Three very, very different perspectives, and I love that reality. We're achieving it already. There's of course a lot of tensions that we are dealing with, aren't there? And Megan, I noticed you mentioned this adaptability. We've all mentioned adaptability, and it's one of those three core elements that you mentioned, Aiden, as well. Of course, the world is, and many people across the planet are looking for stability and order rather than this adaptability and flex. How do we reconcile those sorts of tensions is something that we'll explore throughout our conversation this afternoon and today. So, just in quick suggestion, do any of you wish to respond to each other in that regard? Any thoughts emerge for you? I know, Megan, you mentioned a couple of things. Anything stimulate? Rory, please go ahead.
Please, if I could pick up on a word that none of us really, and it's one that I really think will come through as we go through the flavor of the conversation, was Aiden talked around collaboration and connection. And my sense is that, and I'm deliberately here because I'm bringing a different perspective. I'm a different time zone, I'm a different continent, and I think that's exactly what we wanted to kind of put on the table, is call it that possibility, the magic, the art of change is actually engaging different perspectives. And Africa has a beautiful word to describe it. They call it Ubuntu. And it's this logic of how do we call it it takes a village to raise a child. And it's the sense of the collective. It's a sense of collaboration. It's a sense of community. And my sense at the moment is that that is going to be Africa's gift to the world going forward, is that we intuitively, certainly in the Western models and the developed world, which I've heard an acronym, I call it WEIRD. So it's Western, educated, industrialized, democratic, and rich. Well, a large portion of Africa is not in that headspace, and the Pacific Rim countries and so on. So you look at these complexities, and one of the challenges I want to pick up is how do we connect, collaborate, that sense of community, which I think is very, very evident in the Western kind of mindset, is around me, myself, I, individual, versus what I want to propose on the table is that enough? What about teams? What about communities?
And I think that's we've all answered that question already by nodding our heads, haven't we? It's not enough. Aiden, your thoughts?
Well, I was just going to say, it really just strikes me how interconnected all of our points are. Because I'm raising questions around leadership. Megan's raising some really interesting points around operating models or design adaptability. Rory's raising some really interesting points around kind of broader socio-political context and what have you. And they're also interconnected, right? Because, the broader socio-political context in some ways influences who's going to emerge as a leader. The leader is then going to play a significant role in shaping the organizational design and the operating model. The operating model is going to have a broader impact on the socio-political context. And so just the way that the interplay between all of these things, I think, is just quite extraordinary,
Fantastic interconnections. Love it. Megan, any last thoughts before we're going to move on to our very first significant, specific question we want to address here today? Any last thoughts from you at this point?
I'm great. I'm keen to dive on in.
Okay, let's dive on in. Fantastic. Thank you all for those introductory thoughts. So our first question is, what are one or two forces or factors that you are noticing in the world that you operate in that are driving these complex conditions today and perhaps into the foreseeable future? Just one or two that you're very mindful of, and perhaps it's front of view for you. Why don't we start with, who would like to start? Otherwise, I'll choose somebody. Megan, let's go.
Go for it. You need to wheel, Brad, that you're spinning there. And,
I'm spinning it in my mind, don't worry.
We're all too polite. That won't last, will it, guys?
No.
For me, my number one is really this unprecedented pace of change that we're facing into. I'll start with maybe just a couple of stats, because at Accenture we do a heap of research, and I always find it helps to kind of know what's going on in the big wide world of ours. So 95% of organisations have undergone more than two major transformations in the last couple of years. 61% have done more than four, and some as many as eight. And these are big transformation programs, right? And there's a whole lot more on the horizon. So And yet we're facing a world where a lot of our workers are exhausted. People don't seem to have bounced back since COVID, particularly here in Melbourne. I think we took the award for one of the most lockdown cities in the world. I don't know we'll ever get over that, will we, Aiden? And we've got employee engagement really as low as it's ever been. And change is always hard. And when we look at the pace of change, the Accenture Pulse Change Index we measure every quarter. The rate of change has risen so sharply in the last 4 years, 183%.
Wow.
Just to give you some more numbers, and that's 33% of increase in the rate of change in the last year alone, and it's only accelerating. So that's a pretty major change, I think, in the world in which we operate, the world that my parents grew up in versus the world that I grew up in, and the world versus children growing up in. We can't continue to operate in the same way. We'll burn ourselves out. A couple more little bits of information just on that topic while I've got the floor. The biggest disruptor is now seen to be technology, particularly given the rise of Gen AI. And then that's closely followed by talent. So things like skills shortages, and as I mentioned, and poor employee engagement. And organisations are really struggling to be able to kind of keep up with that pace of change. The work they do is changing. The skills they need to do it is changing. And to the point earlier, how they work with each other is also changing. And so we really do need to find a different way to kind of lean into that and operate in that unprecedented pace of change, and find ways to transform and meet that head on whilst also delivering to our customers and our business as usual. So creating space for that change becomes increasingly important. So I might stop there. I'll close with one quick stat and then see if the guys wanted to jump on in. 75% of business leaders have now acknowledged that the way they work today, the operating models, will be most likely unrecognisable in 5 years' time. That's the degree of change that they're anticipating. And so the question I hope we get into a little bit today is how to get there and how to make that happen.
Yes,
I don't know, guys, do you want to add anything to that?
Amazing. Yeah, Aiden, Rory, any thoughts? Aiden?
Let me jump in if that's okay.
Go ahead, Rory. Yeah,
please.
Thank you. So I'm going to bring a slightly different lens, and thanks, Megan, for those stats. I mean, the 183% is, and the accelerated pace just in the last year. Let me add on to that. 2024 is described in history as the single biggest election event ever happening at the same time. So while you've got this massive amount of change, you've got, obviously 70 odd countries, I think was the final number, around about 2 billion people, that's a quarter of the world's population, were involved in elections. And here's the interesting thing. The incumbent that actually went into the election in power, in most cases, save one, changed. So what you effectively are dealing with is that what you think is happening, even the pundits that are managing the tracking systems, even they were surprised. And I talk about my own country. The ANC has been in power for that whole period of time since 1994 with our rainbow elections. They went into the election and there were some murmurings, but they are no longer the sort of unilateral single powerhouse. We suddenly are now faced with a government of national unity, which is interesting because it happened to us in 1993 going to 94. We were actually at that stage a government of national unity before the ANC took over. From that period of time until now, and 30 years later, you kind of look back and say, that's interesting. The wheel keeps turning. The other thing that I really want to add into that, besides the impact of, should we call it, those things that are out of our control, is I presented at ACMP Global Conference last year. Just my experience of, and the research that I've been doing, is that, Megan, to your point, change is getting faster, it's more ubiquitous, it's like the one constant that we can guarantee. What we can't guarantee is the outcome. What we have to look at is how do we navigate through from a process point of view. And I think that's really the purpose of our conversation today is what's in our control, what's in our circle of influence, and what's in our circle of adapt. Be mindful of what's in the circle of concern, because there's a lot of stuff that we can't manage, but we have to navigate through it. And I mean, Aiden will pick up on that in a moment, I'm sure. But for me, the critical piece in that, when I did that presentation, was I called it the wisdom of trauma. And let me position it like this. The one constant through all of what Megan and Aiden and myself, Brad, what you're facilitating, the one constant is people. Now, here's a soundbite that I want to land. We are all traumatized. Globally, COVID changed who we are. For example, Melbourne, you said, Megan, you're talking about Melbourne as the worst lockdown. Well, we had a similar experience in South Africa. Not as bad as New Zealand, for example, with from an island perspective, you could shut down and stop anybody traveling in and out. We had the same sort of environment with lockdown scenarios, and 2/3 of the world went into some form of shelter in place, stay at home. And the soundbite that was used at that point in time was, oh, we need to pivot and we need to work from home because work has to continue. Let me give you 2 reality checks. Number 1, that's a lie. We were living at work. We were not working from home. We were living at work. Just process that. Because up until COVID, you left home, you transferred across to work, and you took time. And you kind of left the home mindset, and then you kind of got into a work mindset, and you spent time at work, and then you kind of transitioned back home again, and then you left work behind, and you had 2 worlds. The reality was, and I saw it at home, my family. My wife would step out of the door of her office, which was our bedroom, and what used to take her an hour, she was 1 step, and suddenly she was at home. That transition disappeared. The second big lie that COVID really fundamentally shifted for me was they called it we had to socially distance. And you had queues at shops, and you had to stand 1.5 meters away from each other, and you had to cough into your elbow, and you had to wear masks and all the other stuff, even while we didn't know what was going to happen around vaccines and whatever. That was not true. We needed to physically distance, not socially distance, because what it did is it attacked our essential human social connectivity. I almost died during COVID. I'm an extrovert. I need people. And I was banned from being with people. It was traumatic for me. And that's what I say, that we are all traumatized. And the issue is, how do we deal with that? Because I believe it's a lens that the change community needs to be picking up on. I believe it's a lens that the leadership conversation needs to be mindful of. And I believe it's a conversation that every leader in every business needs to be more mindful around. Where and how are my people doing? Aiden, I'll pass it over to you.
Wow.
Yeah, thanks so much. They're awesome reflections. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm listening intently, and I'm also just reflecting on Brad's question. So you were talking about, a couple of things that we're noticing in the world that's driving complexity. So when you use the term driving, my mind automatically goes to, causality. And so for me, there's kind of at least 2 big ticket items that really come up for me. So let me just start with the first thing. And in my mind, one of the key things that's driving increased complexity are the culture wars. And the culture wars, I think, is such a difficult topic to talk about. It's a very sensitive topic. It's a politically charged topic. It's a very emotional topic. And yet, nonetheless, I feel like we have to have the conversation on the table. Because in my view, the culture wars are really playing a very significant role in driving increased complexity, because they're not only influencing tension between countries, but in my view, they're also deepening divides within many countries, particularly in Western democracies and also other countries as well. So when I talk about the culture wars, what do I mean by that? Well, what I'm referring to is that I think there are just fundamentally different worldviews that are in play. And these worldviews are influencing, possibly even determining how we perceive reality, what we consider to be true, what we consider to be the ethical course of action, and how we live our lives. And, in my view, there are probably at least five main worldviews in play at the moment. So the first worldview, I think, is a more kind of traditional type worldview, which is influenced by more theological and religious type perspectives. I think there's a modern worldview, which is more influenced by more kind of scientific and empirical kind of perspectives. I think there's a classical postmodern worldview, which is very skeptical of objective truth, very skeptical of grand narratives, emphasizes that truth is kind of a war between competing narratives and so forth. I think the fourth main worldview is the kind of critical social justice worldview, which is often labeled as the woke worldview, that places a very strong emphasis on identity, on activist-led justice for groups that have historically been marginalized. And then potentially, I think the fifth worldview that we're seeing emerging is more of a meta-modern worldview, which might seek to integrate or at least create a space for all of those worldviews to coexist in some ways. And the reason that I raise this is because I think the culture wars have a huge impact on the political landscape and also the leadership landscape in particular. So from a political landscape, I think that the old left-right distinction either is completely breaking down or has completely broken down. It's not clear to me that it really makes sense to think that of the left as consistently progressive or that the right is consistently conservative. And so I think that we might need a far more nuanced kind of political framework. In my view, and also the view of some of my colleagues, we're seeing at least 10 or 11 distinct political positions emerging. And so rather than contrasting left and right, I think we need to be talking about which left and which right are we actually talking about here. But this kind of complexity really shapes the socio-political landscape that I think Rory was talking about earlier in the conversation. But I think, secondly, all of this, the culture wars really has a huge impact on the leadership landscape because it has an impact on how leaders make sense of the world they're operating in. It influences how they perceive their roles, how they perceive themselves, how they make decisions, how they take action, and what they think good leadership looks and feels like. And so for me, the culture wars means that leadership is not just about skills and competencies and behaviors and all this important stuff, but it's fundamentally about how we're navigating fundamentally different ways of perceiving reality. Yeah, so I think that's at least one of the two big ticket items that's on my mind anyway.
Is there a second?
There is a second. Would you like me to talk about it now, or would someone else like to?
No. Just put it on the table to start with, my friend.
I'll put it on the table. Well, I think the second big ticket item for me is just a general idea of interconnectivity. And if there's one thing that we've learned from complexity science, it's that interconnectivity is a major driver of complexity because the more interconnected things are, then the more one thing has a cascading effect across the entire system. And I think there's just so many examples of interconnectivity, like global interdependence and social media influence and AI, and all of these things kind of have compounding effects. So I think the existence of interconnectivity is a huge driver of complexity, in my view.
Thoughts, Megan or Rory, on those couple of big factors or forces that Aiden's mentioned? Culture wars and interconnectivity. Anything strike you there that you want to share?
If I can go in quickly, it's more a question, I guess. We're now hearing that there are multiple generations in the workplace that we've never really seen before. But I'm curious, what's new? Because we've always had the workplace and we've always had generations in the workplace. And we've always been doing and churning out widgets and whatever, and the economy has been turning. So I'm asking, what's changed? Because in a way, everything's changed, and in another way, nothing has changed. We're still doing what we used to do. We still wake up, we still go to sleep. There's a circadian rhythm. So I'm just curious, what's changed? I mean, I love what you're saying about interconnectivity, but we've always had interconnectivity. So I'm curious. Try and help me understand that a little differently better.
Part of it, Rory, is the pace of change in technology. If you think of the generations coming through, they've grown up in a very different age. I'm making myself sound old with these references to my parents and children and generations, aren't I? But they've grown up with technology at their fingertips. I mean, golly gee, I learned to type on a typewriter. We didn't even have computers on our desks when I was young. They've grown up in an age of social media. And I do think as a result, their social systems, the way they actually lean into that interconnectivity that you're talking about is quite different than the way myself or our previous generations would have done as well. So I don't know, do you want to add to that, Aiden? I think there is such a bigger divide between the different generations now than I think we saw due to that kind of pace of change in the technology that is influencing that.
I agree with you, Megan, totally. So, and I also just, echoing Rory's thoughts. So we have always had interconnectivity, but I think what makes it different in my view is that I think the quality of the interconnectivity has changed because it's become richer, it's become more direct, and it's become faster. So within the matter of 2 seconds, I can send a tweet to Elon Musk or to any head of state around the globe in a way that I wouldn't necessarily have been able to just a couple of decades ago. And so my sense is it's the richness of the interconnectivity, the directness of the interconnectivity, and the speed of the interconnectivity that's really driving a lot of the complexity. At least that's what comes up for me anyway.
Yeah, great.
Very, very good. Wow, that's rich. That's rich territory, my friends. What we're going to do now is turn our attention to this second question. And feel free to add your thoughts as we go along. And very happy for you to sort of work off each other. I think you're doing a great job of that. So thank you. The second question, yes, Megan.
Brad, before we get there, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't maybe elaborate on one of the biggest disruptors, I think, since agricultural and industrial age. And I know that a lot of people are talking about the topic of Gen AI. But I don't think we can skip past what's creating complexity in the system without at least maybe 30 seconds just touching on
you take as long as you feel you need.
that is having on our world. Is that all right?
Yeah, I agree. It's an important point. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, I just think that is bringing. Really just in the last 12 months, even though it's been around for longer than that, but the last 12 months, it's really bringing a massive sense of urgency to the businesses, to the clients that we work with that desire, and it's not just a desire, it's actually almost a desperation in some cases to really embrace that, to reinvent how they work, to reimagine their processes, their workflow, to reshape their workforce and their skills, and make sure they're not left behind. So I won't belabor the point. I'm not an expert in Gen AI, but I at least wanted to put that on the table because I do sense level of desperation
that's
business today to kind of lean into that, and I don't think many organisations are ready to face into that effectively. Their businesses are complex, their tech's complex, their data's either a mess or it's not integrated, etc. And trying to overlay Gen AI on their current world is a recipe for disaster. So
yes.
Yeah, so
can I just
interrupt?
No, that's really important. I think, Megan. I'll
just
pick up on that briefly and see what Aiden and Rory have to share. This notion that there's a desperation is what I wanted to pick up on. That desperation, I suspect, has its foundation in the competitive world that most organisations find themselves in, and this fight or battle or a fear of loss that often is associated with living and operating in those worlds, whether it's a commercial one or it's a community one or it's in South Africa or it's in Melbourne, here in Sydney. So thoughts from Rory and Aiden, just to build on that a little bit. Desperation around Gen AI.
Go first.
Me, yeah. Well, so in a lot of the conversations that I'm having with organizations, I think there's a lot of curiosity and also a lot of fear around generative AI. I think a lot of organizations are still struggling with what the hell can it actually do? how on earth would I even introduce it into my organization? Is there some obligation to introduce it into my organization to be seen as competitive in the market? Are there these huge risks that I'm completely unaware of and I don't really know how to manage? And so I think there's a desperation I think there's different types of desperation. There's a desperation to be perceived to be using AI to be kind of at the leading edge of, whatever industry you're operating in. But there's also, I think, a desperation to kind of make sense of it, to know, what are the risks and the benefits, what are its actual capabilities? Is it actually going to make my organization more efficient and so forth? So I think there's desperation and different manifestations of desperation, at least in my view.
Great comment. Thank you. Rory, your thought?
And I think just to build on that, and I really appreciate Megan bringing it in but who's going to use that technology? And that's why I asked the question just now around generations, because Megan, you're right. I mean, my kids have grown up in this digitally native world. I'll give you a classic example. I was at our traffic light, and the car next to me was playing music, but the music was distorted. It was like, so let me test this with you. I said to my daughter, it sounds like his tape has stretched. And you know what I'm talking about. It was like, you remember the old TDK tape and it got eaten by the machine. And my daughter doesn't know what that is. She only ever grew up with a CD. And now it's streaming. And I mean, you don't stream at the wrong speed. So when I said to them, well, what about if you play the record fast? She says, what are you talking about? I grew up, with the 45 RPM and you kind of, that thing doesn't exist anymore. So yes, the speed of technology is there and the pace of change and interconnectivity, but the people that need to use it. And my question is, and that's where I'm curious, is that, when my daughter gets into the marketplace, she knows how to use the current technology. She's never learned what I have to still unlearn. She's arriving ready to do and embrace what needs to be done. But who is making those leadership decisions around what technology is most appropriate right now, given those governance risks and requirements of the business? Because unfortunately, one of the big projects I worked in is that we had these legacy systems. And when the international bank departed and we were left with, replacing like for like, lift and drop, my portion of the project was a brand and name change. And the reality of the brand and name change was very simple. The regulators were thinking in the same way. It was like lift and drop, like for like, know your customer, meet all the regulatory requirements. And when we explained to them the complexity and the size and the scale of the economic impact of us doing it wrong, in terms of a simple lift and drop, they literally said to us, please don't stuff up the African economy.
That's right.
So kind of take as long as you need to make the decision around know your customer. And I think that was a really interesting lesson for me, is that yes, technology, and 90% of that major global project was technology. But there was another portion around that, which was the marketing piece and the brand piece and the, talk to the heart of the staff. And remembering the staff are dealing with 42 million customers, you're dealing with a huge magnitude ripple impact. That technology, oftentimes, you got to get the technology right. Absolutely. But to give you just the perspective, we landed the brand within a year under regulatory criteria, but it took another 2 years to land the technology to catch up with the brand. And maybe that's a perspective I just want to put in, is that sometimes we need to phase these things without being overwhelmed with what's in our area of concern. And yes, we know technology is a major driver, but garbage in, garbage out. If you're going to overlay, the new system on top of the previous legacy systems that actually need a major cleanup, well, you're actually not helping yourself either.
Technology is nothing without people at the end of the
Absolutely.
day, right?
Oh, beautifully said.
It's all about the people. And at the moment, that is one of the bigger blockers for something like Gen AI. People are they kind of interested, as Aiden said. 95% of people, I think it is the latest stat, see value in working with it, but they don't trust the organisations to necessarily do the right thing by everyone. They are worried about job security. They don't trust the outputs necessarily coming out of some of these early stage Gen AI solutions, and they're worried about the ethics, the privacy, social responsibility. So unless we address some of those things, then the people won't embrace the tech. And we'll be no better off. Go for it, Aiden.
I totally agree. And the other, so I would just add to that by saying, I think that our perception of a relationship to technology is changing a bit because, I mean, strictly speaking, a knife and fork is technology. A pen is a type of technology, and we've been living with these types of technology for the longest time, right? But now it seems like technology is being perceived to be it's an app on my phone, or it's this huge information processing horsepower or whatever that's going to be processing big data or whatever in my organization. And so I feel like technology has actually already been integrated in our lives for the longest period of time. But I think that now when we refer to technology, we're meaning something quite specific. And then it starts to feel a bit scary because we're kind of perceiving it to be something that's kind of separate from us in some ways,
Oh,
Yeah, out there. Yeah,
Mm.
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Very
Yeah.
good points. So it's time for us to move on to question number two, my friends. And here's the question we'd like you to consider. How is all this complexity currently impacting the leaders and enterprises that you work with? What are you sensing or observing are the impacts for them at this present time? Over to Aiden, would you like to kick off?
Sure, why not? Okay, so how is the complexity impacting? I'll tackle a leadership angle in my response. So,
Great, thank you.
I'm thinking about how is complexity impacting leaders and leadership. And again, there are two big ticket items coming up for me. You'll notice that I love talking about things in pairs. So, the first thing is around sense making, decision making, and action taking, and the second thing I think is around the pursuit of truth. Um, and that might take us into very deep philosophical waters, but let's try and tread that skillfully together. So I'll start off with the first thing. So my first point would be around sense making, decision making, and action taking. And I think that complexity has a massive impact on how leaders make sense of situations, how they make decisions, and how they take action. And in my view, these three things are somewhat distinct, but also deeply interconnected processes. But so let me just define my terms. So when I talk about sense making, what I mean by that is trying to figure out what the hell is going on by describing something, just explaining something, predicting what might be happening, and joining the dots. When I talk about decision making, I'm talking about actually choosing or landing a course of action, and that decision might evolve as new information emerges. And by action taking, I'm talking about actually enacting and implementing a decision. And these things don't always happen in a linear order. Sometimes leaders might act reactively first and then have to make sense of what they just did and then decide what to do next, for example. But in my view, complexity makes these things much, much harder because leaders have to consider just a lot more variables. The variables are a lot more interconnected. In many cases, sense making, decision making, and action taking requires collaborative effort not just within teams, but between teams, between organizations, between industry sectors, and so forth. So it's really about doing these things across multiple different boundaries. And all of these things are unfolding in a very politically charged environment. And these decisions are impacting employees, they're in fact impacting shareholders, customers, investors, and the wider public, and so forth. So let me give you a couple of examples of how these complexity is manifesting in my view. So one really hot topic at the moment, I think, is around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, for example. And, there's been a lot of talk about this, particularly in the United States and now increasingly in Australia. And what I'm hearing are conversations from leaders around, okay, so if we're focused on diversity, should we focus on diversity based on identity characteristics like race and gender and minority status? Do we focus on diversity with respect to cognitive diversity or diverse perspectives and those types of things? Or do we actually take a step back from diversity and inclusion already? Completely. How do we kind of make sense of these things given the complex political landscape in which we're making these decisions? If we look at something like some of the recent news around Qantas and the voice referendum, for example. So Qantas had some very public statements around getting behind the voice referendum, and yet the new incoming chair has actually criticized the company for taking quite public stances on very social and political issues. We've seen increasingly in things like sports and so forth that rugby clubs have encouraged their players to wear things like rainbow jerseys and rainbow laces and so forth in support of the LGBT community, while also facing a significant backlash for introducing topics that have become increasingly politicized into sport. I'm an academic, I work at a university. And so one of the things that I'm also very sensitive to is that universities are trying to navigate their way through choosing between a critical social justice perspective and really getting behind marginalized communities, and on the opposing side of the spectrum is institutional neutrality. So we've actually seen some universities like Harvard and MIT and so forth who've actually moved away from mandatory diversity statements from academic applicants, for example, so that they can move more towards institutional neutrality. And so I think that these kind of things are just making it so difficult, because if you make one decision, you're going to appease one particular segment of the population and you're going to really get another part of the population totally offside. Do you really get behind these particular groups? Do you take a step back from that? I think these things are really, really tricky. So that's my first of 2 points. So let me stop there and hand over to somebody else, and maybe we'll get back to my second point if we have time.
All right, let's do that. So, Megan, would you like to add your thoughts?
Certainly, and I know, Aiden, you talked in twos, but you also talked in threes, which is very aligned to my consulting background. We talk in threes, and you actually your model of sense making, decision making, and act taking is very close to the frame we use and the definition we use of enterprise agility. Because what I see is to the question of what's currently impacting leaders and organisations. How is this impacting them today? I see more and more organisations leaning into the need for that enterprise-wide agility, which I really define as that ability to continually sense, adapt, and respond to those kind of market-changing conditions, as we spoke to a little earlier today. And organisations can't take 6 months now or 9, or in a case of a client that I was working with, 12 months to take a new product from idea to market. Their competitors would have bitten them to the bunch. They can't wait for their annual planning cycles to update their strategy and to adjust their business priorities and to build a new team to respond to something that's happening in market. They need to really be able to quickly sense, adapt, and respond in near real time, and shift focus, shift dollars, shift workers to the latest priorities without the hiring and firing and big programs of old. It needs to be much more organic and fluid, and that's really how our businesses need to act today. So those capabilities can't be special programs on the side. They really need to be built into the DNA of an organisation, just like resilience and change needs to be built in. I'm a bit of the stats lady today, aren't I? But a quick stat to leave you with. Most of the organisations we are working with, particularly on operating model and org design in my day job, are really leaning into how can I be more adaptive, resilient, build this enterprise agility muscle. I'm not talking about agile team level practices. I'm talking about the whole organisation being able to kind of morph and change. But 69% of leaders saying that their current operating models are currently unable to adapt to disruptive forces. And
wow.
And it's actually jeopardizing their growth and their business performance. That's the struggle that I see leaders facing into today when they're really dealing with all of this line of complexity.
That's a scary number, Megan. Thank you for sharing that one. It's a pretty challenging number. So, Rory, your thoughts?
Well, let's keep it quite grounded and practical. My background is in psychology, but specifically a passion and interest in education and health, which are real people issues. So let's just rewind it back to COVID. And one of the practical things that happened during COVID is we had to make decisions around it, besides the social distancing and things like that. We had to make decisions around how do you actually engage your workers when everything has changed? And what prepared you for it? So some people were saying it was a black swan event, it was unprecedented. Yet, if you go back in history, the Fortune 500 companies from 2013 to 2018, it was in their annual predictions from a risk perspective. A global pandemic is coming. So when it happened, we all run around saying, oh, nobody expected it as unprecedented. That's not true. So there's your sense-making, decision-making, action-taking in practice. Now, what we found, for example, is that suddenly healthcare was front and center. But the healthcare industry wasn't ready for it. And what we saw is, first up, and they called it compassion fatigue, not change fatigue, compassion fatigue. That suddenly they were doing things that they shouldn't be or couldn't be, that hadn't been planned for. You weren't allowed to visit the hospital to see your dying relative. Nurses now had to literally hold people's hand and actually help them exit. We call that compassion fatigue. I call it trauma, because we didn't prepare our medical community for a new way of being and doing and seeing and showing up. Those very same medical people went home under fear and trauma that they were going to infect this invisible thing that they were seeing the result of onto their own families. So some of them decided that they couldn't go home. So now you had forced isolations. It just compounds and compounds. So then we wonder at a medical health issue level, what's happening to our staff? Because people were living in these circumstances, unplanned, unprecedented, whatever it was, and suddenly businesses became, I call it, they became people-centric. They were suddenly aware of, oh, you've got a XYZ background and your cat jumped across your computer screen while we were on the Zoom call, and, are you on mute and are you this? But suddenly we were actually becoming kind of interested in somebody else. What are your circumstances? Oh, you're living with your aged parents and you've got 3 generations in the house at the same time. Previously to that, you only worried about a person at work. Give me your hands and your brain while you are here for those 8 hours and follow the rules. And actually, I don't care where you live and how long it takes to get to work and what your social circumstances are. That changed. So people-centric. And my interest has been around, besides this thing called compassion fatigue, which in the change world, we kind of called it change fatigue. But compassion fatigue is another level completely. There was a moral imperative on the medical staff. They were dealing with death, trauma, and dying in a way that they were not trained for. And if you think about it, COVID was a global health issue first and foremost. And my question is, what did we learn from that? And 4 years later, as we are exiting COVID, what practices have we applied to improve our healthcare facilities so that we are now seeing people choosing well-being and health and wellness as a positive, proactive? Because I often think as leaders, we still are reacting to the sense-making and the decision-making and the action-taking. It's still a reactive-driven model. We haven't actually applied the lessons of COVID, which is how do we anticipate, how do we circumnavigate in advance, and how do we move towards preventing in terms of a coping with this new overwhelm and new trauma that's going to be landing on us.
Very substantial challenges, obviously, Rory, and they're facing every society today on the planet. In the interest of keeping us moving, I really just want to sort of give Aiden a chance to say he had another issue you wanted to raise, another factor. But I really want to, before we go there, though, maybe you can do this together. I'd love to, with what Rory has just raised with us, I'd love to have your views, Aiden, as an epistemologist. We're now talking about what humankind's desire for knowledge and how we acquire it and what we do with it, and then how does that lead us into a different future, whether we're dealing with societies at large or we're dealing with a family or a community, or indeed these enterprises that we spend most of our lives, our working lives in. So tell us a little bit about that. Maybe you can add a little bit to what Rory was just sharing from that perspective.
Well, I think Roy's making an excellent point, and I suspect from a cybernetics perspective, what we would probably say is there's a missing feedback loop. because
Yeah.
actually there's a catastrophic event that, I mean, had an absolutely terrible impact on, not just health, but a whole bunch of different systems. I mean, from the perspective of complexity, it's a very instructive example, however.
Mm.
But there's a missing feedback loop because something has happened. And I don't think that the lessons learned have been fully fed back into the system again so that we can actually adapt our mental models so that we know how to
Mm.
deal with these things when they arise again.
Future.
Now, I suspect some industries possibly have done a better job, I suspect, because they were more directly hit by some of these things, but I suspect many haven't. Um, so I think that's just one kind of initial thought on the table. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Megan, anything you want to add at this point in question number 2, impacts on leaders and
Thanks for
enterprises?
checking with me. I just want to echo, Rory, the comments you made about what at Accenture we call human-centered leadership. I do think that is a silver lining to have come out of the COVID crisis, and people are much more, leaders are much more focused, and I'd be interested in your perspective on this, Aiden, this is your area of expertise, but are much more focused on kind of the people side of the business, and more cognizant of the impact they're having on their workforce, right down to the individuals. So, and as we know, change, any form of change happens one person at a time. You can't change a business, you can't change a team. Change is a choice. And you've got to win hearts and minds to get people on that journey. So leaders, I think, are starting to sit up and pay attention to their workforce a lot more than they have in the past.
Aiden?
Well, so absolutely. And, I hear a lot of conversations about the need for human-centered systems, which I'm on board with. And I think the other side of the equation, though, is we actually need system-centered humans. So that they
Yes.
can actually perceive the systems. They can work with the interconnectivity. They can, maybe look around the corner and anticipate some of the unintended consequences and these types of things. And I actually think that these two things are mutually complementary. So
Yeah.
yes, I'm on board with the human-centered systems, but I do think that there's another part of kind of another piece of the jigsaw puzzle, which is equally important. And in my mind, that's kind of what we're trying to accomplish through complexity leadership is equipping individual leaders and leadership teams with the capabilities so that they can do the system-centered human bit.
Yes, with you
Yeah.
completely.
Mm.
I know you had one more point, Aiden and Brad. Just a heads up, I
Yeah.
mind adding one too, but you go,
You
Aiden.
go. No, you go. No, do you want
No,
to go
go ahead,
first?
I know
please.
you, no.
Oh, no,
Okay.
yeah.
My my other implication that I just wanted to talk to, in terms of how the sort of impact we're seeing in the consulting field, from the complexity that leaders are facing, is really around cost pressures, and
Mm.
leaders feeling that they need to not just reinvent their business, but they actually need to look at how they can reduce operating costs across their organisation and operate more efficiency as they're leaning in and facing risk, and inflationary pressures, and a broader economic system that is somewhat challenging. We often work on operating model and org design for our clients because they're going through mergers and acquisitions or divestiture, or they have big technical transformation programs, or they have a growth strategy, but cost has been kind of the number one driver and trigger for a number of our engagements of late. And what we're seeing as a result of a lot of those programs are patterns of org simplification, consolidation across the workforce, which is obviously having a flow-on impact into kind of employment rates, and other implications more broadly across the economy. We're seeing process standardization, elimination, simplification, and automation programs. We are seeing companies revisit their placement strategies. And by that, I mean, what should we be centralizing, maybe through shared services? We're seeing them look at outsourcing, such as managed services, looking at other organisations that can maybe support those more efficiently for them. And we are continuing to see a pattern for offshoring certain types of work, more often than not for wage arbitrage, but there are often quite a number of drivers for the offshoring. And we're seeing businesses also revisit their sourcing strategies. So the good old do I borrow, build, buy, or bot is the latest addition to the mix in terms of automation. So, I just wanted to kind of add that into the mix because I do think those political and economic pressures are really driving a high focus on the cost agenda at the moment. And I know that can run in the face a little bit of the human-centered leadership and taking care of our people, but there needs to be a little bit of a balance in terms of, the businesses actually being set up for the future as well.
It's a very, very important point, I think, Megan, because I'd love to just get your views collectively and individually around this notion of cost attached to culture. So we talk about leaders and what they're impacted by, and many of the leaders I talk with are struggling with culture. What are our everyday normalized practices and routines and rituals, and how do we show up for one another and the enterprise and those that we serve? So one of the biggest costs, of course, of every enterprise is culture. It is the human behaviors. And thoughts about how do we go about helping leaders appreciate the true cost of human behavior? Because it typically doesn't appear in our profit and loss statement. True value of human behavior doesn't appear in our balance sheet. Your thoughts on that? Because I think a lot of leaders are struggling to actually normalize these cost elements. And I think your point earlier on, Aiden, which says we need to create or develop system-centered humans, not just the human-centered systems. We need to be focused heavily on people seeing this interconnectedness, and it's normalized, it's routine, it's everyday.
Yeah.
Thoughts, people? Rory.
Can I jump in on that one?
Yeah.
So when I presented ACMP last year, as I said, I presented on the wisdom of trauma, which I believe is a real, and I've used it deliberately. It's a paradox because trauma in itself is a kind of a negative construct, and yet it's the wisdom of. So it's what have we learned and are learning even while our world is changing. And Gallup has published over the years. You're all familiar with the engagement surveys, but essentially you've got, let's just round the numbers up. You've got 20% that I call in the red zone. We call it loud quitting, call it disengaged, call it saboteurs, call it whatever it is, but it's the challenge. And from a change point of view is that's where the resistance is going to come from. They're not going to contribute. So we know there's a problem of about 20%. Equally, if you look at sort of a bell curve, you've kind of got sort of 20-odd%, give or take the numbers, maybe 25%, sort of sitting in that what I call the green robot zone. They're the willing, able, available, and what you do is you throw more work at them. They always say yes. They stay late. They arrive early, and then we wonder why we see burnout. Okay, and where's the burnout happening? It's happening in that group. All right. Then you've got what we call the bell curve, and the middle piece over there is 20 and 20 over there. So you've got also 60% sort of living in the middle. And Adam Grant, amongst many others, but he almost rejuvenated the word languishing. So let's make it very practical. My wife said to me, surely there's got to be more to life than waking up, drinking coffee, working on the treadmill, as the concept of work and living at home and living at work, and then coming out of the office and then having a glass of wine and going to sleep and waking up and getting a cup of coffee. She said, surely there's more to life. And that's that concept of languishing. And the way it was described, and just to recall back a year or three, it was joyless. And what you're finding is that 60% of your workforce are showing up exhausted, disengaged, languishing, joyless. And you want to change the trajectory of your business to Gen AI and the future of work and whatever else and manage costs. And you're trying to do that with 20 to 25% of your workforce. You've got 20% that you're not dealing with. You've got sort of 60-odd% in the middle that you can deal with, and let me put it this way: we should be dealing with them, but oftentimes we aren't, because what we do is we just load more work to the willing, able, and available. Let me leave it at that.
Fantastic.
Can I just ask one thing? So we probably don't have time for this part of the conversation today, but at some point in the near future, I'd love to deepen this aspect of the conversation, because it seemed relatively clear to me that complexity might have an impact on trauma. What I'm also interested in is what's the feedback loop, is how does trauma have an impact on our ability to deal with complexity? Absolutely. And what are the kind of practices and scaffolding and support and what have you we can put in place to help people to navigate that when they're in actually a traumatic state of being, to support them to deal with the complexity that's almost inevitable. And I'm really curious to have that conversation at some point in the not too distant future. Yeah.
I think that is the substance of our next little conversation, friends. That is deep and substantial. You're right, and wide, I think, as well. All right, moving on. We've got a limited time, so what I'd love to do is move to our third question. What are a few recommendations for leaders and organisations to adapt more skillfully? What are just one or two, maybe three, no more than three recommendations that each of you would make to leaders who are struggling with all of this? Everything from the complexity, Aiden, to the culture, to the cost. Well, there's a bit of alliteration for you. They're struggling with all of this. It's really challenging to them. So perhaps two or three of your best recommendations to help them deal with that. Who would like to start? Oh, you're so sweet. Go, Rory.
It's Rory's turn to start. Yeah.
Let me be a little controversial. So I mentioned Gallup a moment ago in terms of engagement, and Gallup has done some phenomenal research. And late February, Gallup published a survey that completely blew me away. So from 2005 and all the work that I've been doing, I had in my head that there are 4 things that followers need from their leaders. And Gallup research has been publishing this consistently and backed it up with data and so on. So I have been talking to my clients and advising my change programs. This is the golden nugget, is that followers need this from their leaders. And I've applied it. And in my head, I was thinking, so stability, certainty is this, a leader needs to have that sense of, boy, where's the direction, and convinced that we're going in the right direction. And that makes a lot of sense, except COVID proved that wrong. The second one was care and compassion. And I've already given you the story of how we became more people-centric in terms of how we managed that. The third one was around trust. And any leadership training intervention has always been around trust and trustworthiness and respect and all those good sort of value systems and timeless principles around how you engage people in processes to produce outcomes. The one that I was always intrigued around was hope, was the fourth dynamic. And in my head, I have been thinking that those are, if you look at equity logic, it's 4 things that followers need from their leaders. So in my head, it is 25% for each of the 4 things. Well, Gallup published in the end of February, and let me give you the numbers based on research that is now statistically significant across the world, not limited to the world of work and leadership. Celebrities, religious communities, politics, you name so they've now got a statistically significant sample. And hope is 56%. Trust is 33%, care and compassion is 7%, and stability certainty is 4%. That for me is an absolute mind blow, that leaders are dealers in hope. And when the leader shows up hopeful and with a hopeful mindset, they can actually engage and encourage and ignite and incite and invite people to contribute in that collective and that community, in that collaborative model, far more effectively. Let me leave it there. Hopefully I get a chance to come back and say some other things.
Beautifully shared.
I think
the thoughts, Megan?
I was just going to add that change done well can absolutely be a really positive source of innovation, growth, energizing people, getting them excited about the future, Rory. So we just need to be doing a better job sometimes of bringing that hope and building that trust, right? And one of the points I was going to make here really, and I'll speed through because I know we're a little limited on time, but is from my organisational design perspective, is investing in your workforce is so absolutely essential. I think, and we call it talent, but I don't mean just top talent. I mean your people, because they're all talented in their own way. I think talent has generally been looked at as you need to go out and attract new talent, you need to recruit people, and yes, you might lose some IP or knowledge along the way, but people have been somewhat interchangeable. But we're seeing key skills in demand, and we're seeing such a pace of change that the much smarter strategy for organisations is to really quickly and continuously be upskilling and retraining their existing workforce. And so, if I was to give one of my two tips to leaders and organisations, it is invest in your people, and that doesn't mean a one-off investment. Again, I'll throw another stat in, but we're all on stats today. The latest research suggests, again, on the back of Gen AI, but not just because of Gen AI, 61% of workers globally will need to be significantly retrained over the next two to 3 years. That is 2 billion people.
It's amazing.
Over the next 2 years. And that training is not a one-off. I was talking a little earlier to someone today about we have just started to introduce some Gen AI agents into our marketing and comms department, actually at Accenture. We've got 17 agents in there now, digital workers, if you like, doing things like research and copywriting and creatives and analytics. We actually give them job titles. They're managed as part of the workforce. Our workforce is now a combination of human and digital workers. It was the existing marketing team that actually identified the opportunities for us to bring in automation and digital workers. They then were responsible for finding space to train those digital agents. Obviously, they know the nature of the work the best. They then, as those agents were trained up, needed to redefine their own role and learn the new skills and tools and techniques required for them to execute that new role. And it wasn't a one-off. It was a rinse and repeat. They then looking for opportunities in those new roles for where we can start to bring in some of those digital agents. And in this case, in marketing, some of those individuals have had 2 or 3 roles in the traditional sense inside a year because of the degree of change we're seeing in the workforce. So what we're seeing is much more accelerated job cycles. What we're seeing is the half-life of skills is plummeting. Continuous learning is becoming the norm, and moving between roles and even functions within an organisation. That transition across different parts of the workforce is becoming the norm. So no longer are people being hired for, the single role and the one job title and waiting for that gold watch. I think that's long and truly gone. But we are really seeing the criticality of organisations investing in their workforce, investing and building skills on a continuous basis. And that is no small ask, and it's a really, really big shift for a lot of organisations.
And a big focus clearly for leaders going forward. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. Wow.
Awesome.
I mean, I can recall the phrase continuous learning sort of emerged in the late 80s of the thought bubble and into the early 90s. And then we did nothing with it for 2 decades, really.
Completely.
And now it's full steam ahead, right?
Oh, yeah. No, and now it's a non-negotiable. It means such a whole different level of change, doesn't it?
Let me quickly move to Aiden. A couple of recommendations from you, Aiden.
Well, I've got 3 recommendations. So recommendation 1 is around complexity leadership. So we're talking in 3s now rather than pairs. So I've moved on. Exactly. I'm evolving. So recommendation 1 is around complexity leadership. Recommendation 2 is around the relentless pursuit of truth. And recommendation 3 is about reinventing what we mean by development of leadership. So let me just say a few words about each of these things. The recommendation number 1, complexity leadership. I introduced this concept at the start of the conversation. And just to quickly recap on a couple of key points before I elaborate. So complexity leadership is about applying key insights from complexity science to understanding leadership and how to develop it. And as I said, I think that there are, at the very, very least, there are three buckets of skills that we need to have in our frame of reference when we're talking about complexity leadership. The first is complexity skills, second is adaptive skills, and the third are collaborative skills. So let me just elaborate a little bit more on what I mean by this, because I just mentioned them before, but I didn't really explain them. So complexity skills are around rising to the complexity of the challenge by seeing and working with different systemic patterns. It's about anticipating some unintended consequences, about navigating and maybe working with multiple interacting causes. This is what I mean when I'm talking about system-centered humans. The second bucket of skills, I think, are the adaptive skills, which are around how are you adapting your mindset, your behaviors, your brain body system in real time. So these are things like self-regulation skills, being able to keep yourself calm, cool, and collected under pressure. Stuff like cognitive flexibility. So how are you able to change your mind or change your beliefs in light of better evidence or in light of a better argument? How are able to demonstrate behavioral flexibility by adjusting how you act, to fit a context. So I think that's the second bucket. The third bucket of skills, in my view, are the more collaborative skills, which is about fostering the sense of togetherness. And for me, this is stuff like, building effective teams, enabling cross-functional collaboration, cross-sector collaboration, standing boundaries between silos, sectors, and organizations and whatnot. So this is kind of what I'm talking about around complexity leadership. The second recommendation, relentless pursuit of truth. This is a bit of a tricky one to talk about in a short period of time. So maybe this is the second follow-up conversation we need to have at some point in the near future.
100%.
But I'll just briefly say a couple of points about this. My view is we have to be able to grapple with the nature of truth and have a mature understanding of what we mean by truth. And in my view, this is a necessary condition for the survival of our civilization. And that is not an over-exaggeration in my view. So I think there's a very important distinction between truthiness and truthfulness. By truthiness, what I mean is when something feels true or feels meaningful, and truthfulness is when something is in fact true, objectively true of the world. And I think truthiness and truthfulness are getting confused and getting conflated, particularly in leadership contexts. The reality is a lot of leaders are dealing with fast-paced environments. We talked about this stuff, right? Complex environments, fast-paced environments, deeply impacted by technologies, AI, and this kind of stuff. And in this context, I think that leaders are feeling really stretched. They're feeling cognitively stretched. And I think in many cases, leaders are defaulting to truthiness rather than pursuing truthfulness. And in my judgment, this is deeply, or not always, but can be deeply problematic, because what it means is leaders are making decisions and doing their sense making based on flawed inputs like ideological echo chambers and logical fallacies and cognitive biases and political pressures and all of these types of things. So in my mind, the relentless pursuit of truth or truthfulness is really got to be front and center. That's kind of my second recommendation. And the third thing I'll just touch on super, super quickly is reinventing the development of leadership. And what I mean by this is, I think in general terms, there are three main approaches to developing leaders and developing leadership. There's event-based approaches, practice-based approaches, and systems-based approaches. So event-based approaches are more traditional programs, retreats, leadership courses, these types of things. Practice-based approaches, I mean deliberate daily practices that leaders can do on a daily basis to just improve their skills, incrementally, bit by bit on a daily basis. That's not necessarily going to be too intrusive in their time. And the third approach are systems-based approaches, which is how we make changes to the broader organizational system, broader social system, and so forth that leaders are situated in. And in my view, I think there's probably a bit of an over-reliance on leadership programs or leader development programs. I still think there's a time and a place for leader development programs, but I think there's an over-reliance on leader development programs. And I think what we really need to do is start to consider more of a shift towards practice-based approaches to development and also systems-based approaches to development. So just to give you a couple of real quick examples. So by practice-based development, I'm thinking of, every time you walk into a meeting, practice noticing some interpersonal dynamics, who's influencing whom, what tensions are you noticing in the room, where's the collaboration flowing, and those types of things. When you're participating in decision-making meetings, start to introduce an ethical frame of reference and start to practice how you can introduce the language of ethics into decision-making in processes and so forth. When I talk about systems-based development, I'm talking about, things like how can you engage more deeply with feedback loops, not just individual feedback, but more systemic feedback across teams and organizations and so forth. How are you noticing different shifting patterns of interaction and these types of things? So I think that we really need to start reconsidering what it means to develop leaders and to develop leadership. And I suspect that
Mm.
these types of approaches may require less time offline. They could be more cost effective, and they may actually be kind of more effective at developing the types of skills that really leaders really need in actual workplace contexts. So they're my three tips. Full stop.
Fantastic. Thank you, Aiden. And I'm going to give 2 minutes to Rory and 2 minutes to Megan as we start to think towards bringing this to a close. So Rory first, then
Thank,
Megan.
thank you so much, Aiden. Just to build on what you've landed there, because we've talked around the collaborative piece, I'm going to leave that. But on your adaptive, in the history of leadership, we've kind of had IQ. So we
Mm,
had to find the intelligent leader, and it was always measured in those IQ terms. And of course, that was a high level of secrecy. It was a labeling system, and it was education based. Then we kind of came to the late 90s and we started saying, well, what about emotional intelligence? And that's the EQ piece. And that got us through another time phase. And we're now in a new space. And I think I call it the new wineskins. We're in the new ways of working. And
mm,
if you carry on trying to do IQ driven leadership, and if you carry on trying to do EQ driven leadership, ay, 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 you're applying the wrong stuff. The world has moved on. One of my colleagues I'm coaching at the moment, I mean, she literally says her mentor is saying to her, "You're 100% right. It's just the wrong time." So the principle here is, what are we
mm,
doing around what I'm now learning around is adaptability intelligence. How do you do what is needed and necessary, just enough, just in time? Leveraging the best of what we used to call IQ and leveraging the best of what we know as EQ. And then you can add into that mix, the political quotients and the social quotients around culture. But the principle is, and that's why I come back to, for me, the summary piece is wisdom informed trauma. What is it that people can do? And here's again, I'm going to drop a bit of a soundbite bombshell. We're all familiar with post-traumatic depression. Let me just leave this one with you. What about post-traumatic growth? What about possibility? What about opportunity? And there is a science around that. So when I talk just now about hope, I'm talking
mm.
around a new psychology, a new way of leading, a new way of doing, a new way of sense making. And let me leave it there.
Fantastic, Rory. Thank you for those insightful suggestions. Megan, last couple of thoughts from you as we start to move towards closing the session.
Sure. I just those comments from Aiden and Rory both really resonated for me. And it's something we're looking at. How I mentioned a little earlier about the degree of reskilling and retraining
Mm.
required. That cannot be, Aiden, as you suggest, through events.
Mm,
um, it
mm,
absolutely needs to be what we call learning in the flow of work.
Yeah.
With kind of the tools, the techniques, the co-pilots, whatever it might be, kind of providing you with that support and that coaching in real time. So the other thing I just wanted to touch on, Aiden, from your comment about truthiness and truthfulness,
mm,
absolutely get that. And I know you broke the seal mentioning the word Trump earlier, Rory. That's kind of what came to mind, Aiden, as you were mentioning that. But I was interested in maybe a conversation for a different time. The prevalence now of data and dashboards and insights and the cognitive brain and the workbenches that are available to leaders now, I thought would have meant that even though they're trying to make their decisions really, really rapidly, it's less of the hippo decision making, the highest paid person's opinion shooting from the hip, and a lot more data driven, and therefore a lot more leaning towards truthfulness than truthiness. But I get
mm,
the idea that these are blurring. Uh,
mm.
and data is not all that. You can always find data to justify your position, one way or another, I'm sure.
Absolutely spot on.
Yeah.
Fantastic, Megan.
But
As the
I suppose just in closing, and I'll give you another topic, Brad, for the future,
Thank you.
because I was keen to wax lyrical about kind of organisational design and how we're starting to see a lot of the leadership roles that we were talking about kind of
yes.
converging, moving away from kind of functional accountabilities and to more kind of cross-company challenges and issues being the basis for even C-suite roles, etc., etc. So again, a topic for another day. But I just wanted to thank you guys for the conversation. I think so many of us individually and of the organisations that we work with are really struggling with this topic. It's a non-negotiable. You can't choose not to deal with the complexity. You
That's
can't
right.
choose not to deal with the pace of change. We need to find smarter ways to working together and more humanistic ways of leaning into those challenges and thriving and avoiding as much of that trauma, Rory, that you spoke to as humanly possible.
Yeah,
So I'll
beautifully
leave it there.
summarised. Beautifully summarised, Megan. Thank you very much. And for my two penneth worth, two things that we can do that is very, very fundamental is to start to teach, but also practice and influence our workforces through the art of dialogue. This notion of a safe, respectful exchange of difference and different perspectives, the sort of feedback you're talking about, Aiden and Rory and Megan, that is really a foundational practice for a future, which honestly is very different from the one we left last century, let alone last decade, and it's going to continue for sure. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Peter to bring this to a bit of a close. And thank you all for your wonderful contributions tonight. Deeply, deeply appreciated.
Well,
Peter.
Brad, firstly, I'd like to thank you for a wonderful facilitation. Well done. That was hugely interesting. I've been listening for the last, I don't know, 90 minutes. It just seems to have flown past. But thank you, Megan, Aiden, and Rory, for sharing your considerable experience and knowledge today. I feel we've only just touched the tip of what's a hugely topical and relevant topic that many of us are struggling with. I want to thank the people who've joined us today on the webinar. We hope you found the session insightful and valuable. As we conclude, I just wanted to share the key takeaways I am personally taking away from this event, which I guess for me, I cluster around three major areas. And the first is embracing the unpredictability and complexity within organizations as opportunities for growth and innovation. The second one is really recognizing the need to understand the interconnectivities within organizations. It's all in the seams. It's all the sort of joining parts that we have to really think about. So thank you for bringing that out. The importance of balancing, as Aiden was saying, the practice of, balancing practice-based and systems-based development of leadership. The importance of investing in your people, Megan, and the leadership design and capabilities required to mitigate the negative impacts of challenges we've discussed today. Rory, thank you for that, on both organizational culture and performance. But finally, the need to foster a resilient mindset and this adaptive capacity to thrive amidst challenges and disruptions. So one really interesting conversation today. Thank you so much. We encourage you to consider how to personalize and apply these valuable insights in your own professional environments to drive that positive change and sustainable success. I suspect we will be continuing this discussion in a further recorded webinar. I'm pretty excited.
Certainly.
We're going to have to
Let's
start
do
paying
it.
showing up now. There is a lot more rich information to come. Brad, thank you to you once again and to our wonderful panel for your interesting and compelling insights, guidance, and thoughts. And finally, it gives me great pleasure on behalf of ACMP ANZ chapter to thank those of you who joined us today on this webinar. And we look forward to you joining us at our future events. Let me wish you all a wonderful day and week ahead.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you all. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.